Okay, I'm very excited that we're at the point of mid-meeting, or maybe past midpoint, getting to the climate session. And we're so happy to have imported Adam Pearson, who's been spending years studying this. The opinions, the attitudes, these are the shapers of our behavior and our culture. And we have a panel of our dedicated members of ABMR who are moving to push this into the field so that we can actually be showing these important connections. So this is an exciting moment for ABMR and a theme that we're going to continue, that Anna and Ian are dedicated to having in the integration of this into our work, because ultimately it's behavior and social change that's going to save us, literally. A note to our remote viewers that the videos are really there, even though it tells you they're not when you click on it. And you just need to actually click on it and then refresh your browser, or as Redford Williams found, open it in a new browser and the video will appear. So try that for now. Thank you. So I turn it over to our moderator and chair of the session, Donald A. Edmondson.
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. This meeting has been so outstanding already, and your courage and your leadership has really been motivating for me, and I appreciate you giving us the time here today. I'm also really excited because Adam Pearson has been a friend of mine and a colleague for a lot of years. We were in graduate school together at the University of Connecticut back when he was doing just good old-fashioned social psychology research, intergroup focus, and he had a big turn in his career, shifting with an awareness of the climate crisis, and I think his career path is going to be one that many of us end up following, whether we're aware of it now or not. Adam is an associate professor of psychology at Pomona College. He's also a member of the graduate faculty in the School of Social Science, Policy, and Evaluation at Claremont Graduate University. He got his BS in biology at Cornell, then did his PhD at Yale in social psych, so very fancy all the way through. His research explores how group dynamics and inequality impact environmental decision-making and collective action. He's guest edited 2 special issues that advance psychological perspectives on climate change, including climate change and intergroup relations, most recently, behavioral climate policy in the journal Behavioral Public Policy. He's a fellow of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, Society of Psychological Study of Social Issues, associate editor of journals. He's won lots of early career awards. He's a very impressive scientist, and very excited to have him here. Adam.
Thanks so much, Don, for that really lovely introduction, and also to Alyssa and others who have invited me to join you today. So, as Don mentioned, I came to climate change about 9 years ago, studying inequality and racial disparities. When I woke up one day and realized, like Don, Kristi, maybe others in this room, that everything I care about and study as a psychologist would be impacted by climate change. And today I'll focus mainly on adaptation, to responding to the challenges that we're facing and that will intensify in the near future. Mitigation often dominates the news and policy landscape, so cutting emissions, getting to net zero. But how do we prepare society and ourselves for what's already here? I'll argue that we psychologists and behavioral scientists of all stripes have a critical role to play, and we have a lot to contribute. And I think a group like ABMR is well-positioned, maybe uniquely well-positioned to do so. But first, a brief tour. So this was a tough year to be a climate change skeptic. We saw another historic season of wildfires and droughts here in California, stunning heat waves in the Pacific Northwest, flooding in Northern Europe, Germany, China, and of course the Eastern Seaboard more recently. And this is the Caldor fire that struck communities in Lake Tahoe, the South Lake Tahoe region this summer. It's still burning, by the way, just north of us. And it's only the second wildfire ever to have crossed the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans lives in a city, in a county or state that received a federal disaster declaration this summer. And 1 in 4 say that they were personally affected by the hurricanes that struck the eastern seaboard. Hurricanes feed off of warmer surface water, so that means bigger and more intense storms. And from attribution studies, we know that the likelihood that any tropical storm will turn into a Category 3 hurricane or larger has grown 10% every decade since 1979. And we know that more than twice the amount of land has burned in the West here than we would expect without human influence. Of course, we're not alone. This could be another image from the Sierras, but it's not. This is the southern coast of Turkey, which along with the rest of the Mediterranean basin will see rapid change this century. Turkey is the 7th largest agricultural producer and one of the largest food exporters in the world, but it's seeing a deepening drought crisis brought on by climate change and also a reliance on water-intensive cash crops. And here are satellite data showing groundwater storage as of January this year, with large amounts of the nation's aquifers nearly depleted. Turkey experienced a 60-year record-breaking heat wave and saw over 2,000 wildfires burn more than 5 times land than what they would usually see in a given year. So in August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 6th assessment report, AR6. This is the first of 3 on the physical science base, and it's perfectly timed for this conference. And reports on human impacts and mitigation solutions will come sometime next year. The IPCC has been publishing major synthesis reports since 1990, about 1 every 5 to 7 years. And one of the more striking features of this report is the level of certainty compared to previous reports. So human influence over the climate system is now described as established fact, that exact language, or unequivocal. And more importantly, thanks to rapid advances in modeling and attribution science, we now have a clearer picture than ever before, and compared to previous reports, about the projected impacts, and especially at the local and regional levels. So here are trends for one of 3 big projected impacts. This is surface temperature modeled under low to high emission scenarios. And the top 2 emission scenarios you see here are seeing CO2 emissions double or triple by late century. The bottom scenario is cutting emissions to net zero. This is the famous net zero by mid-century, the Paris Agreement goal. And the intermediate pathway in orange is currently our most likely trajectory, with global emissions peaking sometime around 2050 and then falling. So the Paris Agreement goal is to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, or preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius. All 5 of the new emission scenarios today bring the planet to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius in warming. And this is within the next decade or 2, at best guess. And most estimates put us above 2 degrees mid-century and 3 degrees by the end of this century. So 1.5 degrees is baked in. It's already baked in. Even if we stopped emissions today, warming would continue to at least 1.5 degrees. And that's thanks in part to the huge blanket of CO2 that we already have in the atmosphere. The tub is full, and we can't just turn off the spigot and expect everything to stop. But there's a big difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius. So today, a heat wave that occurred once or twice a lifetime now occurs about once every decade. And at 1.5 degrees Celsius, that happens every 5 years. And at 4 degrees Celsius, it's every year. So here are 2 other big metrics of global change that we also get from the latest report. This is ocean acidification, sometimes referred to as global warming's evil twin. So CO2, of course, is an acid. And this threatens not just coral reefs, but also more critically, the base of the marine food layer, so the food web, phytoplankton. And from these 3 graphs, we can see that when we think near term, within about 1 human lifetime, we have a fair amount of control over warming and acidification. And this 3rd graph here is the sea level rise, projected sea level rise. So the first 2 graphs are quite sensitive, showing quite a bit of sensitivity to different emission scenarios. And in some cases, some stabilization or maybe even reversing impacts, but not sea level rise. So barring major changes in ice melt, we know the future here. Oceans will continue to rise at an accelerating pace, and that's due to heat transfer to deep ocean. Oceans have risen 8 inches this past half century, and that's a rate that's doubled since 2006, right? These are nonlinear effects, of course. And in every scenario, we see ocean rise at least 1 to 3 feet by mid to late century, this century. Okay, so that's pretty dire. I think summoned my inner Al Gore. Now, 2 slides of good news. So the good news is that rapid decline in the cost of renewables, so in particular solar and wind, means the highest emission scenarios are growing increasingly unlikely. Solar and wind are now the cheapest form of new power generation. That's amazing. This is huge, as energy accounts for about 3/4 of global emissions and is absolutely critical for lifting poor nations out of poverty. With current policies, we're looking at about 3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels, but new pledges by governments as of April this year would lower that warming to about 2.4 degrees Celsius. And other nations may follow suit soon. So as we approach the next major UN climate summit in Glasgow, exactly 1 month from now. And currently 131 countries have either announced a net zero goal target or are at least considering adopting a net zero target. So this is the optimistic targets here, which would put us within striking distance of the Paris Agreement. But that said, of course, right, these have to actually be realized. So the focus on global averages, things like 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, gives us this impression that with climate change, that there's some uniform rate of climate change that's occurring. But maybe the biggest takeaway of this latest synthesis report is that both the manifestations and rate of change are highly regional, they're highly localized. Some locations are changing much more rapidly than others. So these graphs show large regional differences in projected changes in precipitation and soil moisture. And this is at 2 and 4 degrees Celsius of warming. And these are changes, of course, that'll have big effects on food and water security and also human displacement. So warmer air can soak up more moisture, which means more drought or potentially a lot more rain, heavier rains. The precipitation, increased precipitation is projected to occur over high latitudes, it's the darker green here, and parts of monsoon regions, especially in South Asia and Western Africa. And drought is expected to intensify here in the Western United States, also in the Mediterranean and Southern Africa, and in Central and South America. So all of these impacts will increase migration pressure. And in a 2018 report from the World Bank, one estimate we see is that in just 3 regions of the world, in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, we could see internal displacement upwards of 140 million people by 2050. So due to food and water scarcity and also rising sea. So areas that have contributed least to climate change are often those that experience its first and worst effects. And this is also true in the United States, of course. We don't have to imagine what a warmer future will look like. We can actually see it today in every major US city. So cities are warming at about twice the rate of rural areas and the global average. But within cities, the rate of warming is substantially higher in minority and lower income neighborhoods. And these are 2 playgrounds in Richmond, a public housing complex on the left, and a park in a wealthier community on the right. And these are just a few miles away, but with daytime highs that can differ upwards as much as 20 or 30 degrees in the summer months. So in the 1930s, federal officials redlined these neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia, labeling them as risky investments because residents were Black or poor or recent immigrants, using those explicit labels that fueled a cycle of disinvestment for decades in those neighborhoods. And today, these are some of the hottest parts of the city with fewer trees and more pavement, more heat trapping pavement. As the biggest danger may also be at nighttime too, these neighborhoods experience the heat trapped in pavement, continues to, of course, radiate, and that can be a chronic health stressor for these communities. And if you want a rough marker of racial disparities in climate risk, this includes both heat and flood risk. Tree density and other water and heat absorbing greenery is a pretty good one. In majority white neighborhoods in the United States, trees cover on average about a third of surfaces, and in communities of color, less than a fifth. Unless we think it's just Richmond, across major US cities, neighborhoods that are assigned lower grades by the federal government in the 1930s are consistently hotter today. And these are major cities that are ordered by the size of the heat gap, so temperature differences on average. And of course, we know, right, those may be substantially larger on any given day or between any two particular areas. It's not the change in means, but the variance that'll kill us, so the saying goes. And these are also neighborhoods that are more likely to face power shutoffs as residents struggle to pay utility bills that are a bigger share of their income. And that's not just because of lower income, it's also because of substandard housing that's also often less energy efficient as well. So this is Cleveland, and we can see red line neighborhoods on the left and their energy burden on the right. Climate change forces us to consider structural dimensions of vulnerability at a scale like few other issues. Climate adaptation researchers describe really three big elements of vulnerability that leave people of color and the poor, Native communities, older and younger people, those with disabilities, medical conditions at greater risk. So exposure, sensitivity to that exposure, and a capacity to prepare for, cope with, right, recover from that exposure. So higher adaptive capacity helps to minimize effects of exposure and sensitivity, what Rachel Morello-Frosch at Berkeley refers to as the double jeopardy of environmental harm. And another useful way to think about climate vulnerability, and this is from the US Global Change Research Program, is from chemical risk assessment, thinking in terms of exposure pathways. So thinking in terms of direct pathways, and these direct pathways are in blue here, running down the middle, and also indirect pathways, the social and structural forces that shape vulnerability, and those are in the gray boxes here. So social determinants of health and behavior that exacerbate and influence vulnerability. So things like access to healthcare and stable housing and discrimination, those are on the right. And structural factors that impact vulnerability at far bigger scales are shown on the left, like water and energy infrastructure, roadways, crop productivity, and also the physical geography. How hard or easy is it to move around a space? And both sets of factors may themselves be affected by climate change, of course, further compounding health risks. So this is a story we've seen far too often. Here's some historical and recent examples. So Hurricane Katrina displaced over 800,000 Americans from their homes. According to the Department of Homeland Security, this was the largest displacement event since the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl migration of the 1930s. But it only became a disaster because of neglected infrastructure, because of racist zoning laws, poverty, and segregation. That meant people, lacked resources to avoid or prepare for, to cope with, or recover from that storm. So more than 30% of Black residents and nearly 60% of poor Black residents didn't have access to cars when Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And of the 200,000 Black residents who did eventually flee Katrina's floodwaters, only half ever returned, leaving the population of New Orleans smaller, but also more white than it was in 2005. And much more recently, Hurricane Ida is as much as a story about heat exposure, and especially humid heat exposure, and energy poverty as it is about flooding. So nearly twice as many power lines were destroyed by Hurricane Ida as Hurricane Katrina, over 31,000, leaving millions, mostly poor and Black neighborhoods without air conditioning in the most intense summer period in August. And we know urbanization and an aging population mean that these challenges will only grow with time. So this is the reality, but does the public know this? What do people know about their own vulnerability and the vulnerability of others? So one of the more consistent findings is a disconnect, and I think this will sound very familiar to many in this audience, between a growing recognition that climate change is happening and a sense that it'll personally affect me, and particularly in wealthier nations like the US. So these are maps from our collaborators at the program on climate change communication that allow you to see public perceptions right down to the county level. This is from their most recent data from 2020. Of over 3,000 counties, all but 6 have a majority who believe climate change is happening. At the same time, few Americans are aware of their own vulnerability. So just 43% of US adults believe they'll be personally harmed by climate change. That's a minority in most communities. Most recent polls have shown some promising early trends, trends in public concern, and also thinking about health impacts of climate change. And that may be, of course, partly due to the extreme weather events that we experienced this summer and last month. We've also seen some encouraging trends, some major gains for recognition of links between climate change and different aspects of human health, and including within one's own community. So nearly doubling across all categories here, but with low awareness of mental health impacts, which may coincide with many of these events. So these are encouraging trends. As of 2014, 2/3 of Americans reported that they gave little or no thought to how global warming might affect people's health. And only 1/3 could name a specific health impact. And of those who did, one of the top named health effects was skin cancer. So possibly confusing climate change with ozone depletion. What about those who are more vulnerable? So globally, as recently as 2008, about 40% of the global public had not heard of climate change, even when it was defined for them. Have you heard that global warming is happening, that the planet is warming? And some recent estimates suggest awareness may be growing, but about 1 in 5 in the most recent World Gallup poll in 2019 indicated that they didn't know when they were asked if climate change poses a threat to their country. So among those who are aware, though, more vulnerable nations are more likely to think climate change will be personally harmful. So the y-axis here is a measure of the strength of each country's climate mitigation and adaptation policies, so a measure of climate resilience. And wealthier nations that are shown in blue here generally top the list. They have more to invest. The x-axis is the percent of respondents in each country indicating that climate change will harm them a great deal. This is based on surveys of 75,000 Facebook users from just this year, March this year. So those in more vulnerable nations are twice as likely to report personal vulnerability. So there's some understanding of personal risk. And we see a similar pattern within nations, including the United States. So political polarization, as we all know, has been growing in the US since the late 1990s. But this masks key demographic differences. And these are data from over a decade of US public opinion polls. The solid blue and red lines here show the familiar growing political divide among white liberals and conservatives. And the shaded green, if you can see it between the dashed lines, shows the political divide among Black and Latino respondents, shown here in aggregate, but we find similar effects when looking at these groups separately. So the divide is growing, but is considerably narrower among these groups who show higher perceptions of personal harm in particular. And those elevated personal risk perceptions hold among both moderate and conservative Republicans, and also predict more support for mitigation policies. And we found similar effects for class. So conservative whites and lower income with lower incomes and less education levels show greater concern for climate change than conservatives with higher income and education levels. So the threat of climate change may be more personal in ways that may narrow the political divide among these and other vulnerable groups. But awareness of personal vulnerability, of course, may not always translate to awareness of climate disparities across groups. And in fact, this is what we see in a 2019 survey of the most climate engaged within the US, young adults. So 86%, and this includes majorities of Black, Latino, and Asian respondents, reported that climate change would impact people of color about the same or less than others. And similarly, a majority, although a smaller majority, 55%, reported that climate change would impact poor people about the same or less than others. So some notion of, as we saw, I think, early in the pandemic, that climate change may be a great equalizer. That may have something to do with the sort of the global language that we use around the phenomenon. So we don't really know yet whether COVID or growing attention to issues of racial justice, even within climate discourse, may mean more awareness of climate inequities. This remains to be seen. So there are remarkably few public opinion polls that actually measure public understanding of climate-related inequality. I think that's one of the most damning gaps in knowledge currently in at least public opinion research on climate change. So what does this mean for behavioral science? We need mitigation. That includes more investments in technology. We need more net zero commitments. Even better, we need world governments to realize those commitments. But we also need to better prepare people and ourselves for what's here and what's on our doorstep. And a National Academies report in March that was convened to advise the US Global Change Research Program, which is the federal government's response to climate change, argues for three major shifts in how we approach climate change. Ratchet up adaptation plans quickly, with a much heavier emphasis on risk management. Invest in social science research so that the knowledge that we produce is more useful to decision makers and local communities, and expand cross-cutting research. But of course, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This is actually a message that we saw about 40 years ago. In 1979, Baruch Fishoff was part of one of the very first interdisciplinary climate working groups in the United States that was organized by the American Association for the Advancement of Science at the behest of what was then the new Department of Energy. And their task was to assess the nature, the causes and societal consequences of climate change. And Baruch summarizes the work of this group in the lead article of our special issue that Don mentioned in Behavioral Public Policy. Shameless plug here, that just came out last month. His article is well worth a look. And what's most remarkable is that this initiative recognized a critical role for behavioral science, and it provides a partial blueprint, and much of their summary could be written today. So this includes a focus on health and decision-making, and an emphasis on incentivizing interdisciplinary work. So behavioral science was involved early on at the start, but faded from view for much of the intervening years, and that was partially due to the gutting of social science research funding during the Reagan years, but also because climate change became viewed as a technical problem, right? We can maybe just invent our way out of it to solve the CO2 emissions problem. And that includes a viewpoint that was held by many in our field. Of course, this didn't stop interest groups from using our science to sow doubt in climate science. So I'll highlight 4 takeaways from this report and their relevance today. So behavioral science is more welcome today in climate circles, climate science circles, than in the past, but our role has often been a limited one. And in the words of Baruch Fishoff, we need to become players and not just conveyors of climate science and climate policy. So behavior is often a black box in many climate models, often shown in aggregate as human emissions. And we need to better understand how people respond to climate change and also its unequal impacts. But we also need to speed the adoption of climate science in our own work. The accelerating pace of climate change means that environmental factors will increasingly dominate human behavior and human health, and we need to understand these changes. And to do that, we need to seriously engage with our physical science colleagues and engineers and other climate researchers and create stronger incentives for doing that very hard work. And the localized effects of climate change, these very impressive models and attribution models, Also point to a need for local partnerships to reduce health risks, and that's something I think ABMR and others in public health are perfectly positioned to do. Climate change is a public health emergency, but if you looked at state and local government public health department websites, you wouldn't know that. So analysis that came out last year, looking at what local public health departments write about or speak to in terms of climate change in 2020, found that only 1% of US counties and 4% of US cities mention climate change. And fewer than 1%, so 8 cities out of more than 500 that they looked at, had original content that discussed local health impacts of climate change. So this is a big opportunity for behavioral science. But if we know anything, it's that we can't just go charging in. Right? We need to understand how people respond to these risks. We often talk about scaling up interventions, but a big challenge, I think, is downscaling what we know to help communities on the ground. The good news here is that we have the luxury of foresight. Right? The climate models today give us a lot more of a granular view of the problem, and we don't need to imagine what a 2 or even 4 degrees of warming might look like. It's here in many parts of the world and every major city. Climate scientists talk about adaptive capacity, the ability to prepare for, respond to, or recover from climate impacts. What is our adaptive capacity as organizations, as institutions, and what can we do now to enhance our ability to respond to what's here and adapt to what's coming? So we built our research and training programs, our academic societies and institutions for a climate of the past, one that's more stable rather than one that's changing. Behavioral science is behind the curve, there's no question, but limited investment so far means an amazing opportunity here to be responsive to the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That talk, I think for most people in the audience was either something you sort of disengaged from, and it's sort of like, yep, okay, here's another thing, another thing, another thing. Or if you really stay engaged with it, it's truly terrifying. It's something unlike any human society has ever existed through, and that's the case. We live now in an atmosphere that no human society has ever experienced, and as Adam says, we know the future for the first time. We know the future. We actually know the future because it's physics. It's not, we think politics works this way or that way. Could I ask to have the panel slides put up, please? So at this point, so the other 3 of us up here are behavioral medicine folks, more behavioral medicine than Adam. And we, I think, represent different parts of behavioral medicine as a field, different career stages. So each of us will briefly introduce ourselves, and we have sort of 1 or 2 responses to Adam's talk, 1 or 2 sort of big takeaways. And then I want to open it up to the rest of the audience here so we can actually have a discussion about climate change and how we as a field should respond to this knowledge of the future. So great, so this is us, behavioral medicine in the era of climate change. This is me, I'm Don Edmondson. I'm the director of the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. I'm the PI of the Science of Behavior Change program. And my research focus has been on the psychological and behavioral influences on cardiovascular disease recurrence risk. So I focus on CVD patients, heart attack patients, stroke patients, how their reactions to heart attack and stroke influence whether they'll have another one. And that's what I've done for the last 12, 13 years. I've become a tenured professor. It's a great life and all that good stuff. And I have zero interest in continuing to do that work the way that I've done it in the past. And my sense is that over time, the rest of you will end up agreeing with me. We've moved to a different planet than the one that we've all been accustomed to. But we've kept all the systemic problems from the old planet and brought them into this new one that's now less predictable, more dangerous, less hospitable to humans. We built our societies in a really finely tuned Holocene, and we've moved into what many scientists call the Anthropocene. I think a good example of what we're looking at, for years, scientists in infectious disease and epidemiology warned us that a pandemic was coming. It was a really high likelihood that a pandemic was coming. They warned us that it would hit Black and brown communities worse than first, but also that no one was safe. Pandemics would get everyone. We didn't prepare the way we could have. Many of us were caught off guard. I think our field in some ways was caught off guard. Pandemics, though, are a blip. They're short. It feels long. It feels forever. Climate change is actually forever. It's changing our everything about the sort of board that all the games of humanity are played on. And I think that while we can at least think about the first order effects of climate change, the things that Adam talked about, for those of us in behavioral medicine, the second and third order effects are truly terrifying, whether it's food scarcity, the political instability that comes with mass migrations. I doubt that there are many of us in this room who are climate change deniers. I doubt that, right? Any climate change deniers here? Not hard deniers anyway. I do think that almost all of us are soft deniers. I think that when we hear a talk like this, we compartmentalize it. We're not truly convinced. We're standing on a train track, and there's a big train coming. But we're not really convinced that it won't just jump off the track. Maybe it'll go a different direction. Our interventions, our science, we think about stress, we think about behavior and their effects on cardiovascular disease, morbidity, mortality. But very soon, as Adam suggested, things like extreme heat, drought, extreme hurricane strength floods will overwhelm the small effect size, the moderate effect sizes that we've become accustomed to and are proud of. Our interventions that those that have worked, that we've been proud of, can't be expected to work in this new world. We're learning, and we know that heat and extreme weather are killing people today. Urban heat islands, outdoor workers, particularly when it comes to cardiovascular disease. We also know that this is just the beginning. The non-linear acceleration of all the things that Adam talked about, all the negative feedback loops, the vicious cycles. I'm a little scared here just talking to you because I know that there's an overwhelm that comes with talking about these things that can lead to a shutdown. But we're friends. I know most of you, and I know where most of you are coming from. I know what you care about. And so I've decided to be as honest as I can and let out some of well, there are emotion words in there, but they're out now. But one of the people who's helped me find a constructive way to deal with feeling like Cassandra from the Greek has been Kristi White. She's an assistant professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine at University of Minnesota. Her primary area is climate change, sustainability, and health. To date, she's been focused on advocacy. She's been doing clinical health psychology and implementing change in health systems, and really on the front lines, talking to people dealing with climate angst and anxiety and various other things. She's a freaking hero, and I really appreciate everything she's done for me personally, and I can't wait for you to hear from her.
Wow, thank you for that very generous introduction, Don. This is really, it's overwhelming. And so how many people here are feeling really overwhelmed after listening to this talk? Okay, thank you for your honesty. I feel overwhelmed by this all the time. And I think that's one of the most important things to think about and to lean into is acknowledging that it's overwhelming and being able to face it. Because we all know about the bystander effect, right? The bystander effect does hurt people. It's harmful. And so if we continue with this sort of soft disengagement, then we are acting as bystanders when we know this terrible thing is coming. And so I think one of the most important things that has come up for me is being able to sit with that discomfort, being able to process through some of the climate grief and distress, and finding ways that I can expand my own circle of influence to make some sort of meaningful change. Because one of the best antidotes for climate distress and that feeling of overwhelm is meaningful, useful action. So this doesn't mean that you all have to completely change your area of research or, take a sharp turn in a different direction. But we can do things like ask our institutions provocative questions, right? We can ask, where do we bank? Is there a way that we can shift our financial interests away from organizations that have historically funded fossil fuel infrastructure or still do? That have engaged in predatory lending practices. Maybe thinking about the way in which you do research. What are the ways that you reimburse your patients or your participants? Are there ways that you can do that in a more sustainable and equitable and just way? So there are so many different points of entry, and we're at the point where we need all hands on deck. And so finding your own points of entry and what that means for you individually is better than sitting by and doing nothing. So pick something, don't pick nothing.
Thank you, Kristi. I think one of the couple of things that we may intuit is that not everyone's expertise that we built in the Holocene is going to be so useful in the Anthropocene. But one person whose expertise will certainly be useful and is useful is Dr. Alison Holman, professor of nursing, University of California, Irvine. Her research is focused on biopsychosocial predictors and long-term mental and physical health outcomes of collective trauma. So she's done work looking at how hurricanes impact, wildfires impact large groups of people's mental health, also things like 9/11 and basically all the terrible things she's been willing to look at for us. Dr. Holman.
Thank you, Don, for that lovely introduction. All the horrible things, I'd love it. I'm joking. So one of the things that, having sat through this conference so far, one of the things that, and especially Adam's talk, that strikes me is the one constant that we're all dealing with all the time, that's change. That's the one constant that everybody has all the time, from our cells, from our mitochondria, that's for you, Martin, all the way up to our planet and our solar system. Everything is constantly changing, and people don't like change. So our work is cut out for us, right? And people like Kristi, who is doing this work in a clinical setting, is doing some amazing stuff. So I just want to say I tip my hat to Kristi for being able to come up with ways to address some of this stuff. I'm sorry. One of the things that's really important to understand as we talk about rate of aging and pace of aging is that it's not just the pace of aging or the rate of aging. It is the rate of exposure that is also dramatically increasing and has been dramatically increasing for a very long time. And we've been turning a blind eye to it. But our exposures are increasing on a regular basis when it comes to not just climate stuff, but other kinds of traumas, especially in the United States. And for the past 20 years, my colleagues and I have been doing work on collective trauma. And any kind of collective trauma, and it could be terrorism, shootings, hurricanes, wildfires. I did my dissertation on a wildfire. And what we're finding is that this cumulative exposure that people experience, whether they experience it directly by being in the community that was affected, or whether they experience it indirectly through the media, because media definitely matters. Whether they experience it indirectly or directly, that accumulation of exposures sensitizes them to the next experience of stress or trauma in a community. And the media accelerates that process. And what our research has shown is that over time, as we experience these kinds of events and we have these reactions, those reactions help us become more worried. And this is a tip to Julian and a lot of the work that his colleagues have done on perseverative cognition. People get stuck in this place where they start worrying about what's next. But guess what that worrying does? That worrying makes you go back to the media. And that media makes you more sensitive to the next thing. So we're starting to see, and we've demonstrated in some of our work, that we have a downward spiral where people become more distressed, they watch more media, they become worried, they watch more media, then they're more distressed, and then et cetera. And so it leads to emotional exhaustion. And the pandemic, right now we're doing a study on the pandemic, and my studies have been in nationally representative samples of Americans. We use large panels. And, you know, with the pandemic, we're seeing a major collective stressor, right? Everybody experienced it, the initial part of it, and then it cascaded into all these other things, right? So we had the pandemic and we had to go home and we had to socially isolate. And then we had to bring our kids home from school because our kids were not allowed in schools. And we had to deal with economic downturns, and we had to deal with whatever else people were dealing, the threat of being evicted in the midst of a pandemic, when if you were evicted and put on the street, you were much more likely to catch a deadly disease that would kill you. This is the reality of what Americans are facing today. And that cascading set of events, those collective events, they've, along with all that cumulative stuff over the last 20 years that we've been studying, has led to emotional exhaustion. People are tired. You know, people are tired and exhausted to deal with this. And unfortunately, and this breaks my heart because I am the mother of 2 kids who are mixed race, and they're scared. They're scared to death to deal with what this world is coming to. And as young people and as people of color in America, they're facing the reality, you know, of how many years ahead of life on this planet at a time when being a person of color puts them at a disadvantage in society. And that scares me as a mother. And obviously I am very passionate about this. I'm sorry for getting all upset, but I want to point out that we are already seeing, I've seen some reports of late, we are already seeing cardiovascular events increasing as a result of the pandemic. We think as partly a result. It's not clear, but we're starting to see that there are higher rates of cardiovascular events going on for people. And that the mental health consequences that we're seeing from these kinds of events are going to also fuel future cardiovascular events, future greater risk of whatever it might be, dementia or whatever you might have. All the things we've been talking about. So to me, guys, what matters is that the pace of exposure is going up. And we need to find ways to deal with that. And we need to find ways to help people change behavior, which we hate to do, right? We have to find ways to change behavior now so that we can stop this process from creating this pandemic of not just mental, but physical health consequences that I unfortunately imagine are coming down the road in the next few years. And I've got a longitudinal study. I'm going to study it. But yeah, we've got a lot to do, guys. And we can't let our kids lose their future, because when you lose your future, it messes with your mental health. So we've got to protect our kids, and we've got to protect communities of color hard and fast and now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't know I was going to cry.
Thank you, Alison. Who wants to talk now after Alison? Seriously, we'd like to open this up to everyone here to join this conversation. Please get us started.
Amazing panel. Thank you so much. You know, a lot of the behavioral and psychosocial problems that people like us have traditionally been focusing on are not going to go away because of climate change. Some of them may get worse. And just thinking of some obvious examples, a hurricane comes and destroys your home. Your poor diet is still a problem, maybe worse than it was before. Or we are trying to help people engage in more exercise. But if they're living in a neighborhood that's getting hotter and hotter, their opportunities to go out and get exercise are diminishing. So I'm wondering if the panelists, if you have some ideas about how we might incorporate the impacts of climate change, those kinds of impacts into the kind of work that many of us are doing and will still be doing on health behaviors and psychosocial problems that could be exacerbated by climate change.
Thank you, Ken. That's an outstanding point and an outstanding question. Do y'all mind if I jump in and do this one first? This is the first thing that I think about when I think about how I'm going to apply this knowledge that Adam's brought to us to my own research in the same way that over the last, years now, but really ramped up in the last 2 to 3 years, that we've understood that in order to do behavioral medicine that actually reflects the world, that we have to account for systemic racism. We have to account for the structural aspects of white supremacy that influence people instead of just, co-bearing, we're going to put racial category on there. I think similarly, all of our research going forward will need to include that sort of hyper-local, we have the data, climate data, geographical data, tree coverage data, urban heat island effect. We can know this at a really fine-grained scale. We had a paper out of Columbia a couple of months ago, looking at hour-to-hour fluctuations in temperature and MI rate in New York City. So we can estimate these really well. The question is, how do we adapt our science, our interventions to help people to do exercise in the summer in New York City, because it's miserable. Yes,
Jump in
please.
real quick too. I just wanted to jump in really quick. Thank you for your question. From a clinical perspective, that's something that I'm asking not only myself, but many of my colleagues. How do we become more climate aware in our clinical practice? And so some of the things that I'm doing with patients I work with, say, for example, I have a patient who has diabetes. And one of the things that can happen for people who have diabetes is because of the microvascular complications, they can't thermoregulate as effectively. And so they're at greater risk for things like heat-related illness, right? So if we know a heat wave is coming, what's your plan for staying cool? What type of insulin do you use? Is your insulin refrigerated? If we lose power, how are you going to keep it cool? What are some of the ways that we can adjust and adapt our care plans for our patients to become more climate aware and to deal with the environment that they're operating within? And so from a clinical perspective, those are some of the same kinds of questions that I'm asking and incorporating into the treatment plans that I do with patients.
If I may, please. I love that stuff. I love that stuff. One of the other things that we can do when we're talking about helping deal with trauma, you know, there's trauma-informed care. It's the social workers developed a way of approaching and coping with trauma. There's been an upgrade to trauma-informed care by a professor at San Francisco State University, Sean Ginwright, and he has developed a plan of approach to coping with major trauma in communities, and it's called healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement is focused on helping to looking at a person holistically versus trauma-informed care, which is you identify and you recognize and you acknowledge the trauma that a person has experienced. But healing-centered engagement says you're more than the trauma. You've got strengths, you've got other things going for you. And the premise of healing-centered engagement that I think makes it a really wonderful, more collective-oriented approach is that it takes people who've experienced structural racism in their community, or whatever it is that's going on in their community, or whatever the trauma is that's community related, and it engages them literally in trying to change that trauma. So instead of saying to the person who's been traumatized, you need to be resilient, it says to the world, we acknowledge what happened to you. We want to encourage you to do something to stop that trauma. And that in so doing helps people find meaning and purpose in changing the events instead of having to change themselves all the time.
Thank you all so much for this. I have a lot to think about. And thank you all for your passion and commitment. Okay, so something that came to mind for me, and I think that's also been echoed, but not directly addressed, is the role of racialized capitalism. Mm-hmm. And how that has so many root causes in what we're discussing. I think a lot of it is we're saying, you know, these communities of color are specifically impacted by the effects of climate change, but that may have also been orchestrated. And how can we talk through that, thinking about why it's here, and then move to plans that more readily engage some of the practices that these communities already have. I think about, you know, historically Fannie Lou Hamer's farms where she was using sustainable practices to engage farming. How can we bring that into this conversation in a real way and think about how we can engage a more holistic way to approach climate change and not erasing communities of color in this conversation?
Thank you, Lauren. That's such an important point, and I'm really glad that you bring it up, because I think one of the things that has been really important for me in doing this work is recognizing that there are many communities who have been doing this work for far longer and have a lot of wisdom and value that we need to honor. So in Indigenous communities have so much wisdom and brilliance around how to engage in land management. There are grassroots environmental justice organizations that have been doing this work for a really, really long time. And so as we come into this space, we need to be cautious not to position ourselves as the experts who are, going around telling people what to do, but rather bringing our expertise to the table and asking how can we be helpful and how can we lift up the voices of the communities who have been doing this for a really long time. And also reckoning with the real history that a lot of these racial disparities that we see that exist because of structural racism are going to be made worse by climate change, and they were orchestrated or put in place on purpose. Right. And so in order to have these sort of systemic and structural interventions, we have to start from that understanding and center equity and justice first in order to be able to really address some of these disparities that we're seeing. So I'm really glad that you're raising this question, and that's something we all need to center as part of this work.
Adam, I feel like you've also done some work in this area and thought about this as well.
Yeah, I would say, that's a beautiful question. It's such a critical one. I think climate change to me, forces us to reckon with inequality, but also to think about and the we, I'm using the royal we here, that is heavily inclusive of what communities are doing currently. But forces us to think about maybe creative solutions to addressing climate change that also start to address underlying inequities that have structural causes. And I take, personally, I feel a lot more comforted these days in the last maybe five to 6 years that I've been teaching about climate change from undergraduates and their own thinking and the ways that that's evolved from, you know, counting carbon footprints, personal carbon footprints, to now everything's about structure and structural causes. And I think some of that is coming from a shift in attention in policy toward understanding structural issues like today, single family housing that pushes out communities of color and exacerbates segregation in ways that can then magnify the impacts of disasters and climate change. We can also look to cities like Cleveland. Cleveland wanted to understand a few years ago how they could put a climate mitigation and, more importantly, adaptation plan in place. They spoke to their community, and what emerged from that plan were 3 concrete goals. One was about tree cover and vegetation, addressing inequities around the city. But 2 other pieces, and I would say the more critical pieces, were affordable housing and the construction of housing that would be cleaner and more energy efficient, and transportation, right? Access to transportation. And it turns out that if you look within the US nationally at what are highly popular programs, public transit is massively popular, including across the political spectrum, from some recent conjoint experiments that Madam Mildenberger has done at UC Santa Barbara. So there are certain solutions I would add in there too, pushing for a clean electricity standard and the uptake of renewables within utility companies. And those can have positive effects on communities from the reductions in emissions and pollution that's impacting people. And if you think about it in terms of, say, community solar can also help to empower communities that are harmed independent of climate change. So where community solar programs could generate revenue and reduce the energy burden in a switch to renewables.
Thanks, Adam. Alyssa, do you have a question or a comment?
I'm just so grateful to all of you for bringing us some of the most important and valuable and honest messages for us to think about. And I'm really emotional right now. My first is an admission to being a soft denier and to being to compartmentalizing. And I think you let us all really absorb the reality of what you're saying. And I'm just so grateful. So I want to be honest and tell you that when we start talking about adaptation and what we can do, on one hand, it's low-hanging fruit for what we're trained for and where we're placed. And on the other hand, I'm really depressed talking about adaptation because we all only have so much bandwidth in our lives and our energy. And the reality is the crisis is here, so we need to adapt. We can't ignore adaptation. So for every ounce of energy we put into adaptation, I hope we can put at least an equal amount into mitigation. What is mitigation when we're one single person on the planet? I think it is using our science of the mind and the influence and contagion of attitudes and emotion, and realizing that we are agents of influence. And so the little bit we can do locally will add up. So I don't want to lose sight of the power of awareness and talking about this and using our platforms, whatever they are. UC is a biggest employer in California. We use a sickening amount of carbon. We have a plan for 2050 with the help of our colleague Adam Arone, who's a social psychologist at Irvine, the experts throughout the UC system have dissected it, meaning the faculty, and it's just a bunch of bullshit. There is zero reduction in carbon burning. It's all about offsets. And that's the good guys. That's a university system. So I don't want to be blind to what's really happening in the world and the politics. There's a lot of good happening, and there's a lot of the capitalistic system, you know, that's rooted. That's thank you for your comment, Lauren. So that is, we just can't be naive. We need to use the science of advocacy and the science of the mind, or it's just game over. So I'm really both depressed and also kind of heartened to be connected as a group talking about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. That depression is a problem. And I think one of the really powerful things about that question, about connecting climate change to extractive, racist, purposeful capitalism, is that there are people getting rich off this knowingly. And while thinking about adaptation may make us depressed, almost always, most of the friends that I know here, when they think about inequity and racism and structural racism, they have a righteous fury, and that's on the other end of the spectrum from depression. And the two are the same thing. Increasingly, the two are the same thing. And I think identifying with that righteous fury, for me at least, has been useful.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to come back to your comment about feeling the depression that sinks in when you come to the acceptance about what's coming. And I've been so fortunate to have worked with many patients in hospice or palliative care at the end of life who have invited me to walk with them through the end of their life. And also working with patients who have a progressive illness. And I draw a lot from the work that I've done with them and what they've taught me. And I kind of think about it as similar to, we think about our planet as almost like a person with uncontrolled hyperglycemia for a really long time. We know an amputation is coming. It's just now we're asking ourselves, is it going to be your toe or is it going to be your entire leg? And both are bad. We don't want either of those, but the reality is there's an amputation coming. And so what can we do to prevent it from being worse and recognize that even with the amputation that's coming, there's still meaningful time there. And so how do we find a way to continue to do this work and find meaning and purpose in the remainder of the time or with the time that you have? And that has been really helpful for me in working through some of the distress around climate change and climate grief.
Please.
I know we're getting late on time. I'm Sue Everson Rose. I'm at the University of Minnesota. Kristi will soon be a very close colleague of mine, so I'm thrilled at that. So I would just wanted to share something. It actually builds on Lauren's comment and Kristi's response. And this is something that Paige Green shared with me and some others in the American Psychosomatic Society just 2 weeks ago. It was an article in Stat News. I'm going to actually read the first 2 paragraphs, and then I will make sure to share the article. Some of you probably have heard of it. It was published September 23rd. It's titled Health Equity Tourists, How White Scholars Are Colonizing Research on Health Disparities by Ashley McFarling. Fueled by the massive health disparities exposed by the coronavirus pandemic and the racial reckoning that followed the murder of George Floyd, health equity research is now in vogue. Journals are clamoring for it. The media is covering it. And the National Institutes of Health, after publicly apologizing for giving the field short shrift, recently announced it would unleash nearly $100 million for research on the topic. This would seem to be great news, but a stat investigation shows a disturbing trend, a gold rush mentality, where researchers with little or no background or training in health equity research, often white and already well-funded, are rushing in to scoop up grants and publish papers. STAT has documented dozens of cases where white researchers are building on the work of or picking the brains of Black, brown researchers without citing them or offering to include them on grants as co-authors. And I think we as a field need to remember that. And I think in terms of not just going to community, working with community to do our work, but thinking deeply about who we're including and whether we are the leaders or whether we're being team scientists. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's a very important topic. And that's part of the reason why I brought up the work being done by Sean Ginwright, because that is very centered and focused in the community. A lot of his work has been in the Black community, but he goes into many different communities and centers the community and the voice of the community in that work. And I think, you know, the job that we have is not to be the ones leading the charge, but rather be the ones who are connecting with the most affected communities and providing, to the extent that we have privilege as white scholars, providing some support for raising their voices so that their stories, their needs, and their voices are the ones that are being addressed, not ours. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And so there are communities out there, there are local groups that are doing this stuff. And I think, yeah, being advocates, I'm a nurse, advocacy is number one. We have to be advocates and humble in the way that we address these issues. So thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said, Alison, and you as well, Sue. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think we as white scholars and scientists need to remember that it is our responsibility to dismantle our own white supremacy and white superiority and how we go about our work. That's our job.
Right.
Many of us come at this work from the desire to help, but the way it manifests and functions often shows up as white saviorism, virtuous victimizing, and it's really problematic. And so we as white scholars have a lot of work to do to dismantle our own socialized white supremacy and white superiority if we're going to take these structural approaches to equity, even within our own science. I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you, Sue.
So maybe one more question and then lunchtime.
So this is I'm going to make a statement first as I don't want to be a survivor, but as a person that went through Katrina and went through Ida, 2 requests. So the first is that when you talk about our story, that you make sure that it is accurate and that when you talk about where the inequities were, that you're clear about it. Having experienced the influx of white researchers into our community after Katrina, and then the abandonment right after, it was something that devastated our ability to research in our communities for years because of the lack of faith and trust when external people came in who had resources and funding and power and studied Katrina and then left without any intervention or any support. The most important thing I can tell you about Ida is that we did it a lot better. And that the reason we did it better was we built it at home. So when you think about this, when you think about studying, it is absolutely about building capacity in our communities of color. It is about not cultural competency, but cultural responsiveness. And it is about beginning the conversation before you even think about the study. My second comment is that one area that we haven't talked a lot about is the kids. Kids don't have to grow up like us and be resistant to change. They can embody it. And I think that thinking about how we can really build that in our youth is a really novel approach to this, because it is going to be something they're going to face, is that change. And how does that change be something that we embody? And they've got more energy than us, it turns out. They're not jaded and their telomeres are really, really long. And my last thing speaks to how grateful I am for the conversation we're having about how we work with communities, and to tell you that we started a new model. And so we just got a center grant. And probably half of the money is actually going directly to community organizations and partners. It baffled my institution. They're kind of grumpy. But when we talk about being partners, it means giving our resources to them. It means putting their names on grants as actual people who will get a subcontract. So of the 1.2 million we have this year, about 500,000 is going to grassroots community organizations, because we want this to be something that builds their capacity, not ours. And so I challenge all of us to think about where we can do that more effectively.
That's awesome. I love that. All right, so I'm looking down the row here at faces, and I thank y'all. I think it was pretty intense, and I really appreciate you showing up, and I know it can be a little tiring, but I know we have lots more conversations to be having throughout the rest of the weekend. And thank you all for being here, and everyone who's out.
Thank you.
I think we need to come back at 2 again, give ourselves enough time. It was, we're planning on starting at 1:30, but I just think that I know that we can't make it back by 1:30. So we'll be back. Please try to be back by 2 sharp. Thank you. Lisa, if you can tell the Zoom audience, that would be great.